with anyone else who's taking part, please do. We'll try and get through to your questions at the end and answer some of them if we can. So today we talk a lot about in higher education about preparing students for work, but when employers are asked what's missing, the answer is rarely subject knowledge, which universities are very, very good at. Across thousands of employers surveyed by QS, the biggest gaps are consistently in critical thinking and judgment and problem solving and communication, alongside things like adaptability and interpersonal skills, as AI really reshapes how work gets done. And what's striking is that these gaps aren't sector specific. They show up everywhere. They're not about teaching more content. They're about how effective graduates can apply what they know when problems are messy and time pressured and ambiguous. So today isn't another abstract conversation about transferable skills. It's a practical one. What actually changes graduate outcomes? Where do skills really live in the student experience? And what should universities stop doing because it looks good on paper, but doesn't actually shift the dial? To explore that, I'm joined by colleagues from the University of Limerick, the University of York, and my colleague Martin from QS, One Mentor in particular, the part of QS, focused on employability and skills, bringing together employer evidence, institutional practice, and real interventions. And our aim today is really simple. We're going to have a chat around this topic, but we hope that you can leave with a clearer view of the skills landscape, a sharper sense of the cost of inaction, and a few ideas that you can actually act on. So let's get into it. I'm Andy Plant. I'm the Executive Director for Europe here at QS, and today I'm delighted to be joined by three experts. I'm joined by Joan Concannon, Chief Reputation and Stakeholder Relations Officer from the University of York. I'm joined by Chris Ineni, Director, Transferable Skills Unit from the University of Limerick, and I'm joined by Martin Serrano, Product Director for Sector Intelligence here at QS. So I guess, guys, how are you qualified to be here? Joan, why should we listen to you today?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much, Andy, for asking York to be part of this panel. I've worked in higher education for a very long time. I won't go into the specific number of years, but a long time. And I think it's really fascinating the way that higher education has evolved. So I very much agree with your premise that academic skills are integral and foundational to the employability of our students. I think what has emerged over the past few years, and perhaps even pre-COVID, is the complexity of the world that we're operating in, geopolitically, but also from a technological point of view. And so I think universities are having to think very differently on their feet as change is happening all around them in terms of the way that graduates need to be able to be equipped to respond to that level of complexity. So I guess my role is really, it's board level. I report directly to the Vice-Chancellor, and I'm thinking a lot at the moment about the graduate retention in the area where York is, in the north of England, and the ability to ensure that we are much closer to employers to be able to retain more of our graduates, because part of my role is positioning the university in the context of economic growth. And if you want economic growth and you want innovation, then graduate skills are going to be critical to that endeavour. So I can touch on those a bit later on.
Fantastic.
But I'll hand over to Chris.
Yeah, look, I suppose I've been working in the Transferable Skills Unit in the University of Limerick for the last over 2 years, and before that on transferable skills for a number of years. But I suppose for a long time I've also focused heavily on using problem-based learning, particularly with a view to building students' problem-solving skills. But prior to coming back, I only came back to academia. I'm a relatively recent. I'm not a lifer. I worked out in the so-called real world in community development, rural development, international development with the UN for a period. And I suppose I began to have a sense of the need to integrate the workplace reality with the university reality, and I suppose that's where my background brings me. And I suppose in my current role we have a lot of engagement with industry. The University of Limerick has had a long-standing program of work integrated learning. So the university has a very strong emphasis on building student capacity through work integrated learning. So this move into transferable skills is just a natural extension, I think, of that.
Mm. Yeah, we didn't know when we were planning the webinar, did we? But Joan is actually an alum of Limerick as well. So
she's a graduate of the department that I'm part of, the Department of Politics and Public Administration. And Joan is Joan, I haven't looked up your transcript because that would be breaching data regulations just to see how good a student were you. But so.
I had a brilliant time at Limerick. It was absolutely amazing, and it was just ironic getting the call and then realising I was going to be on a call with somebody from Limerick.
Well, from York to Limerick to Ecuador, we're joined by Martin Serrano. Martin, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Sure, thanks, Andy. Well, hi everyone. Good morning from my side of the world. But yeah, why am I qualified to be here? I think for over the last decade, I started actually from helping students, so working with students, helping them find jobs. And for the last decade, we've been working on how can we create AI and technology that can track the labor market in real time so that we can understand what are the skills that are missing, what are the skills that are changing, how are employers actually defining jobs and skills, and bringing these data directly to higher education, to government, specifically also to students. So how can they start creating their own pathways, connect that to curriculum, and then, as Chris mentioned, connect that to the real world to make a sense of it. So we had Google's initial support, and now very happy to have joined QS a bit over 2 years now. So yeah, looking forward for today's conversation.
Awesome. So maybe I'll ask you each just a very quick question, just a short answer, maybe to sort of get us going, get us warmed up. So Joan, when you hear transferable skills, what's the most overused phrase and what do you think should replace it?
I'd say that's given Chris runs a transferable skills unit, but I think I'm not sure that transferable skills captures the full gamut of how much the skills landscape is changing around us. And I think reputationally for higher education, we need to be more perhaps explicit in what we mean by this and how we're responding and equipping our graduates to move into labour markets that are so dynamically changing. So I guess things that I think about therefore are around augmentation and resilience, but also future reskilling. When cards on table, Martin and I have worked on a really major report looking at the UK's National Industrial Strategy from the perspective of future skills requirements, and the taxonomy that QS have been able to produce for the first time of looking at the 1900 or so occupations across those 8 priority sectors is really phenomenal. And what it shows us is that graduate skills and postgraduate skills are going to be enormously critical, despite some of the political narratives you hear in the UK that would suggest actually we need lots more level 4 education qualifications. It's just not true in terms of the delivery of economic growth. So I think the things that we're really pushing hard now at a sector level is that graduate criticality to economic growth opportunities, which we've calculated as being an opportunity for technological augmentation across those sectors, amounting to £490 billion worth of economic growth in the next 5 years, but only if the supply chain of graduates is coming out the door with those skills.
Yeah. Absolutely. And Martin, you look at data from hundreds of thousands, millions of alumni, graduates going into the workplace. What's one skill graduates underestimate that matters more than they think?
It's a very good question, Andy. I think it's impossible to just pick one overall, but I think transferable skills are definitely within that realm. I think just to piggyback on what John was saying, I think transferable skills, the problem is it often sounds very vague. And when you ask the students, they struggle to articulate, like, what does it really mean? How do you actually apply these? And a lot of times now, for example, you see data analysis being also a transferable skill. Like pretty much every single role you're going to be in is going to require these. So I think for students and alumni, what we see is that they are being thrown into a world that doesn't have these labels for skills, essentially. It's mixed human, soft skills, hard skills, specialized skills, transferable skills, however you want to call them. And the key part is how do we help them articulate the skills, identify them, communicate them outwards, and apply to them, and for them to know how to navigate these across the different roles that they'll have throughout their life.
Yeah. And Chris, one thing that employers expect from universities, but that universities often maybe don't emphasize strongly enough.
I suppose you could go into, you answer this in a variety of ways. If I give an example from one student that I visited when she was on her work placement, and I said, what was the most difficult skill you had to master on your work placement? And she said, answering the phone. I was terrified. So in some way, there's a bit where some of this stuff is very basic. So she was in the office of a member of the Irish Parliament, and all the TD's office, and answering constituent queries at the beginning. This is what freaked her out most. But I suppose we do hear, and we run in the University of Limerick, we run an industry spotlight series every week where we're bringing in representatives of big multinational companies and small and medium-sized enterprises to talk to our students. Now, they are emphasizing the whole transferable thing very strongly, but I suppose the one thing we do hear from them a lot is problem solving, but also not just industry standard problem solving, because industry has its tools and techniques of problem solving. But what we do here is more critical problem solving and creative problem solving. And I think maybe part of the issue is that some of these skills have been presented as being separate from each other. So essentially, and I have a colleague working on research on this, on a model of critical creative problem solving. So how do we bring these things so that these skills are not seen as, oh, well, I've done the problem solving, now I'll move on to the critical thinking. But it's often that ability to deal with problems when they develop into a higher level of complexity, so that people can deal with basic stuff. But what happens then when it takes a bit of an unexpected turn? So do people have the capacity to deal with those? So I suppose that's probably what we hear most from employers. But if they were to put it in a nutshell, and it was a senior talent specialist from Verizon, one of the biggest telecoms company in the world, said this last week, that they really are more interested in the type of person that's coming into them. They want the rounded person. It's not just, as Martina said, that those kind of technical skills. They want because some of these skills they can teach and they can develop in them, but it's the rounded person.
Yeah. Well, this is probably a good question to ask at this time. For audience participation, this is your chance to have your say on a quick poll, which I will try and launch now if the technology allows it. So the first question is, fundamentally, do you think it is the role of a university to deliver skills? And I'll give you a few seconds to answer that. Please do click yes or no. And the second part of the poll is asking you, how embedded is skills delivery at your institution? Are you at the beginning of that journey? Do you feel you're some way along, or do you feel that you're advanced? Okay. Right, I'll give you just a few more seconds for people to answer those questions. I think, Chris, it's fair to say that Limerick's taking this fairly seriously. I think yours is the first transferable skills unit that I've come across.
Yeah, no, I'd have to say I have a colleague in Dublin City University who was the first director of transversal skills, they call it, and this kind of goes back into the point that John was talking about, that sometimes terminology changes from one place to the other. But but ours, I think, we have colleagues in the University of Galway, in DCU, in Dublin City University in particular, who are also working very strongly, and I suppose we all try to collaborate as much as possible on this.
Yeah. So I don't know whether you guys can you see the results of the poll?
Yep. Popped up for me.
I will. I'll end it. But anyway, just to sort of reflect briefly on it, do you think it's the role of the university to deliver skills? Overwhelmingly, yes. 3% said no, and 97% said yes. And then how embedded is skills delivery at your institution? Not very, 11%. Moderately, 58%. And advanced, it's embedded and mandated, 31%, which is actually a little bit higher than I was expecting. Any reflections on those results? Was it what you were expecting?
Well, overwhelming relief that most people think that skills are an outcome that universities should be delivering, because reputationally, when you hear employers sometimes standing on the sidelines complaining, that's a real concern. And in the UK, I think it's universities are getting a bit of a kicking at the moment. So I think it's a real it's a really big issue in terms of being able to prove that universities are delivering for the economy. And it's certainly an area that we take very seriously.
Yeah, I suppose I could add to that, and picking up on a point that Martine was making earlier. Part of the difficulty with this is, well, what are we supposed to do with them? We hear this term transferable skills, but what does it mean? So one of the things that when we started this work that we had to do was to actually say, well, what does it mean? Because we can't just go to students and say, you need to be a good problem solver, and to say, well, what does that mean? So we borrowed and leaned on and built on a whole series of international frameworks from ESCO or DigComp or GreenComp, these various frameworks, and we developed a set of competency frameworks for 7 core skills that we focus on. So we're focusing on critical thinking, communication, collaboration, creativity, the 4 C's that tend to be very strongly promoted, and then along with that, problem solving, sustainability, literacy and action, and digital skills. So for each one of those, we've developed a competency framework so that we can say to students, well, when we say you need to be a good problem solver, this is what it means. So for example, I can solve problems in a collaborative setting, and I understand the role of emotional intelligence in working in a group. That's just kind of an example. So that's the kind of complexity that makes the difficulty of jumping from the belief that universities should focus on transferable skills to how do we do it. And I can say a little bit more in a little while about how we've approached this in the University of Limerick.
Great, thank you. Martine, I'm gonna jump to you. You speak to universities not just in the UK, Ireland, but all over the world. And when they come to you worried about skills, as Chris was describing there, what problem are they really trying to solve?
So I think related to the poll, because I was pleasantly surprised. But the skills challenge that universities often approach to us, it's really more of an alignment problem. Universities are already teaching skills. Like this is already intrinsic to it. But the biggest challenge is, are we aligned to what the job market is currently looking for? Is AI changing so quickly, but we operate in a pace that curriculum takes longer? So how can we start understanding our gaps? And a lot of it comes by analyzing and kind of identifying the skills within curriculum, identifying and translating the skills from jobs. And the last component, which I think ties to the challenge that universities come to us, it's how can we make this visible to students specifically? Because unless the students see it clearly and understand how to articulate them, again, evaluate the skills that they have, doesn't matter how much work we do internally for our universities, we're never going to be able to take it out to the world if the students are not the ones embodying it and carrying it outwards. So I think to just summarize it, Andy, a bit, it's this alignment of, can we speak the same language and track the same things as employers? Not necessarily because we're supposed to be skills factories, but because we're already doing it. And we can show the value, the connection by mapping our curriculum and then making sure that our students are able to take this forward. And it doesn't just sit with usually us, the people in this room, when the students are the ones that carry the voice forward, that drive our reputation, that become, as John has done a fantastic job, actually the reputation of Limerick going out into the future and being able to bring his experts into different fields.
Yeah. I think there's a piece here. Our York Strengths framework sounds very similar to what Chris is describing, even though we don't have a unit, as it were. But a lot of the first part of the employability journey for our students is around self-reflection, of understanding the skills they already have and they haven't perhaps thought about them in an employability context, but then also the kind of the experiential pathways that we can provide. And it's really mirroring, we're a research-intensive university that is highly multidisciplinary. And I think over the last few years, what we've really concentrated on is that multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary ethos through the skills framework of thinking about that on the teaching side as well, and working really closely with employers. So the York Strengths programme that we offer to all of our students was co-designed with employers by dint of the fact that we wanted to be able to keep pace. I think there's still huge amounts more that we can do and should be doing around that. And there is the perennial issue. It's really interesting that 31% of our audience, they have a mandatory element. There is still a tendency for universities to think about this as sort of an extracurricular thing, or something that you can opt into. And I think what you get then is a self-selection where some of the students who would most be supported are the ones who aren't opting in, perhaps because they don't have the confidence to do it in the first place. So I think there's a real issue there about how much you mandate those additional skills, portfolio development opportunities that go well beyond the academic skills within degree programs, and how much you can embed. So we've got interdisciplinary modules, particularly around sustainability. We've got a community education framework giving people the experiences that give them the confidence to go out feeling job ready. But I think the skills piece as well, at least in the UK, there is a reputational connotation to universities themselves actually being able to think about skills in the way that it's tethered to economic development, the opportunities for universities to place themselves on the playing field to deliver economic growth, rather than sometimes just feeling like you're standing on the sidelines watching business and industry getting the credit for economic growth. Innovation typically tends to start inside universities and then move out into the marketplace. And we don't always do ourselves the best favours by being able to describe what that looks like.
Yeah, there's a sort of narrative sometimes, isn't there, in the media, Mickey Mouse degrees and this sort of that sort of
the irony of being critical of something called a Mickey Mouse degree with one of the most successful brands in the world never ceases to amuse me, although it does exasperate me as well. And I think we really need to grab hold of the idea that somehow we've had a succession of higher education ministers in the UK who typically get up on their hind legs to give a speech where they start off saying you don't need to go to university to get on. Actually, most of the time you do. And the work that we've done with QS shows just how critical graduate skills are going to be to deliver the economic growth that any government around the world. There's nothing particularly profound about the UK's National Industrial Strategy. It's probably similar to most advanced nations. The issue is we've sort of lost the narrative that graduate skills, when politicians talk about skills in the UK, more often than not, they're talking about plumbers and ship fitters, to name two recent examples, rather than actually the idea that graduate skills are absolutely the critical scaffolding for economic growth.
And Chris, is that something
I do think? Sorry, I was just saying I do think there's a challenge to universities. This is going back to Martine's point about alignment, but the companion word that goes with alignment is visibility. And I think one of the big challenges is, and it's a lot of debates in the literature on transferable skills and this, do you treat them as something separate or do you see them as being integrated into the curriculum? And I think it has to be both. But in terms of integration into the curriculum, Martine is absolutely right. A lot of these skills are present. Many lecturers are doing group work. Many people are doing problem solving. Their students are doing presentation. They're learning communication skills. They are using digital media. They're learning digital skills. But there's been some interesting Australian research in this that shows if students are explicitly told that there is a skills component happening, it registers with them that they are now developing the skill. If they see that in a recurring number of modules, they can say, oh, okay, there's the skill isn't just in one module, it's coming up across my entire university journey. So we've actually tried to develop even a very simple legend of icons that we ask colleagues to embed in their course outline that they could put into a VLE or into a course outline that says critical thinking, problem solving, so that students begin to recognize this and it becomes a much more explicit component. And then I think that in some way begins to speak to Joan's point that universities can say, well, yeah, we are doing skills and this is how we're doing it and we make this explicit. Now, I do think we also need to have some parallel process of direct engagement with students to encourage them to recognize what they, how they are developing skills. So it's a bit of a twin track approach, an integrated approach, and then a direct student approach is supposed to change the culture of thinking about learning and the evidence of their learning and what they're getting out of it.
Mm.
I very much agree with that. We're doing a lot of work at the moment with our students in terms of co-curation of the interdisciplinary modules that are shaped around experiential work learning. And I think that's been really interesting in literally getting our students to recognise their own strengths, but also where they have gaps, and working with them to think about what are the experiences that they need in order to build that skills portfolio.
Yeah, that's quite valid. Go on.
So sorry, may I add one point? Because I really want to emphasize a few of the points that Chris and John have made, especially kind of like on scalability. I think a lot of these skills challenges, it's a data problem, essentially, which is, I think part of the approach that we have is if you don't measure it or if you don't track it, you can't measure it and you can't improve it. I think a lot of times with skills, what we're saying is we don't have the data, we don't communicate it, we don't map them, we don't tell students, we don't have a way to measure and track it. So there's no way for us to improve it as an institution, though we're doing it. But if we put a few of these items, identifying them, specific kind of trigger points to evaluate, are the students communicating it? What level are they in communication or so forth as they progress? How does this connect to their own pathway? That would just allow us to have these data points, these interventions to make sure that this hits all students at scale instead of like the typical, but here's 10% of the students come to career services or 20, but those are the 10 and 20 that don't have the problem of getting the job. So how do we get the other ones and not let them fall through the cracks? So I think just as we have here, Chris, for example, coming from a unit of transferable skills and so forth that creates frameworks and that is the new, I think, key reality for universities, that in this new world, it's a new thing that we need to just embed into how we measure and track things to make sure that they happen. And I think the biggest challenge, though, is then how do we personalize this experience to the student? So a lot of the work that we see is we have a student doing business and they do a lot of presentations and they understand communication very clearly, or at least one area of how communication comes up. But then we work with engineering students and they're like, well, you know what? I'm never going to be standing in front of 2,000 people talking. But if we can rephrase and help them understand the communication, even from a technical engineering standpoint, is critical. How do you communicate difficult technical concepts to the product person that probably doesn't have that? And that's key communication. Then the students really start personalizing their journey based on the outcome that they want to achieve, based on that role. And we can just break them down like little, essentially Legos, that they really pick it up. And they're actually a lot faster than we expect the students to be able to adapt to these new realities, to these skills, to these tools that we can use to really hit them at scale. And then I'll pass back to you, Andy, or to my colleagues if they want to add anything.
Can I just add something to that as well? I thought one of the most fascinating things about the work that we've done with QS was expanding our own knowledge of the sheer scale and diversity of occupations across the 8 growth priority sectors of National Industrial Strategy. I mean, that taxonomy just blows my mind every time I look at it. But what we're now looking at is how do we tell our own students what the art of the possible is? Because sometimes I think the narrowly framed interpretation of I'm a biologist and this is what is open to me, rather than actually the identification of the skill sets across something like 700 of the occupations are common to at least 3 of the sectors under interrogation here. And yet schools are very far away from the labour market because of the intensity of the curriculum design in the UK context, where there's a sort of sausage machine feel to A-levels in particular because it's very, very deep, but it's very, very narrow. And so they come to university, particularly research-intensive universities, where the idea of critical thinking, rather than a points-based system of I know how to get an A, is almost the first barrier and hurdle. We have to almost break them apart and put them back together again. But then it is also about the scalability of opportunity across the diversity of the curriculum, but also the skill sets and the sheer diversity of occupations that are available to graduates. There is a piece of work there as well that I think it's very clear in my mind now that the reputational issues of the higher education working more closely with both public and private sectors to demonstrate the range of opportunities that are available in a hugely turbulent but also very exciting future labour market as well. And I thought the positives of showing actually the sort of media tropes around AI is going to chew up huge sections of the graduate labour market, rather than actually what we've shown is augmentation is the actual story. There are huge opportunities for those who have embraced the right skill sets, both academic and non-academic. That the future is theirs, and we need to be much clearer and much more upbeat and positive about the impacts of technology on the labour market for any graduates.
I guess the narrative could be that a degree in its own right now, and a sort of knowledge-based traditional degree, is essentially a hygiene factor now when graduates are entering the labour market. How they demonstrate the skills they have on top of that have also perhaps been embedded within their degree or extracurricular is really important. But then universities' jobs, as Martin was describing there, is how do you create a framework that allows them to do that and evidence that in a way that builds a personalised journey for them, so they can see the horizon and sort of guide themselves towards it with our help.
Well, it's funny, Andy. It's funny, Andy. You should say that.
Chris,
because do you want to ask the question? Will I just launch?
Fire away. I think you're primed and ready.
No, it was just picking up, from your intro there and Martin's point, just how do we make this visible for the student? And how do we make it manageable, and how do you track the journey? And I suppose a few years back, this was the challenge, I suppose, that we began to look at. We have a mantra, and not the mantra I get up every morning and look to the east and say active, conscious, confident. That's our mantra for the students. We want them to be skills active, skills conscious, and skills confident. Now that means they have to do a bit of work about it. They don't just need to be in some way assume that they have these skills. So we did a number of focus group with students, and eventually we came to, I suppose, and you'll see we like combination of 3-word phrases. We came to a campaign called Recognise, Record, Reward. And this campaign essentially is encourage students to recognise their skills and where they get them, and that there are multiple domains where they can gain their skills. They get skills from their modules, from their academic programs, from their work placements, from Erasmus, from being involved in clubs and societies with the student unions, from part-time work. So we get them to try to recognise their skills and use our competency frameworks to help them to do that. But then crucially, it's no good just recognising the skills. They have to have a platform to record them. So we've started using an e-portfolio called Portflow, where we've set up templates on that, where students are facilitated to gather evidence about their skills. So essentially we're saying to them, your task is to be the curator of your own collection, your own gallery of skills. And every so often you will record evidence about those skills, put it into your e-portfolio, and then at a particular point you may curate that collection, and you may show that off to a potential employer or somebody you want to share it with. So recognise, record using an e-portfolio, and then the reward, again, and this was something that came to us from students. We offer skill-specific digital badges now the students can apply for and gain once they use their e-portfolio. They can put those digital badges on their social media platforms, whatever, LinkedIn or wherever they want to put it. But crucially, again, the students said, we would like that to appear on our graduate transcript. So if a student gets a digital badge, that will also now appear on their graduate transcript alongside all their module grades. So it's that specific bit, that Martine was saying, well, how do we track this journey? How do we individualize this journey? How do we record this journey? And for us, it was that recognise, record, reward approach was where we came down with it.
Mm.
We have something similar called the York Award, which is a little culmination of a whole plethora of similar sounding skills portfolio development. I think the issue for me is a lot of that is still quite dependent on in-person and opt-in. And I think where we're looking now is the use of technology to deliver the scale of how we can reach more students more easily to deliver that at a kind of mass scale. institutional level. The other piece I think that's really interesting is connectivity with alumni. So alumni engagement is part of my reputation portfolio. We've now created a York for Life interactive platform, and a lot of that is geared around opportunities to maintain connectivity between people who are students at York, but also then more recent graduates. I sometimes think that when we get really big name speakers in, it can be almost, it's inspiring, but it's also slightly off-putting because people struggle to imagine themselves being like that, superstar in whatever the sector is. Whereas actually when you connect them to people who are on their second or third job, there's a sort of relatability piece there about them imagining themselves 5 years hence rather than 25 years. And I think that connectivity piece is really important as well. But there's also I think that the issue is also about reskilling in that technology augmentation piece, and the necessity of universities to think very differently about future educational provision. Going back to something you said earlier, Andy, about the degree is the hygiene factor. What is the way in which universities are going to come to the party at scale to deliver reskilling when roles start to become obsolete, but the reskilling opportunities on the augmentation side of the balance sheet are there? And so we're really thinking very hard about micro-credentials, the scale up of our online school, because if you're in an industry and you've got family commitments, you're not necessarily going to start all over again and say, I need to do a whole new degree program. You're going to want to have more unbundled learning opportunities. And I think online there is going to be really critical to be able to deliver that.
Yeah. I guess it's the question, isn't it, of where this lives within a university and where, and how it's evidenced. And in a world of, we haven't talked about it that much yet, but in a world of AI, how can assessment and teaching be used to sort of combat AI, the de-skilling that happens around that? How can we put something in place that allows that to happen? I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah.
So I think there's still an over-indexation of a media narrative around AI in the context of plagiarism and cheating, rather than actually thinking about, we are now educating the first cohorts of really truly digital native students who are using AI in every context. They will be using AI in their work lives, and we need to embed how to critically analyze the use of AI in a much more explicit way, rather than just worrying about the idea that AI is being used for nefarious purposes. How do we actually teach? So a really interesting example in our business school is one of our professors is running a program where students are explicitly told they have to use AI to develop their essays. But what he's really testing and what they get marked on is their ability to then analyze the effectiveness of that AI contribution to the work that they've done. Because in effect, in a work environment, you will be using AI, but then you have to know, have you asked the right questions? Have you used it appropriately? Is it giving you the right answer? Because it's certainly not a given that it will.
Yeah. Chris?
And look, this is an issue I face. I'm teaching a module of 230 first-year public administration students at the moment, as well as doing my transferable skills work. And this is an issue we're having to face. But I think, I think we have to take it seriously. There was a report in The Guardian last week, I think, started by one of the UK teachers' unions, where 2/3 of the respondents indicated that they believe that their, second level students were losing critical thinking skills because of the use of AI. And if they're only beginning to identify that at second level, well, then it's only getting worse when they appear in third level. I think there are three elements to it. One is certainly the academic integrity element of it that we have to take seriously. And I suppose part of the response to that is by developing a variety of alternative types of assessment, but also not just being tempted to rush back to the traditional in-person exam. That doesn't really do anybody any good. I think there is significant reputational gain from universities to be saying that, well, look, we are recognizing, yes, people have to learn how to use AI, but we are approaching this in a very holistic way. We're not just saying, how can we punish people who use AI inappropriately? We're trying to develop our assessment approach, and we do have an AI task force here in UL, and I sit on the assessment subgroup of that, specifically to try to tackle this issue. But I think the crucial bit is, while yes, we encourage a wider range of assessment. And yes, we encourage and teach people the proper use of AI, but we do have to recognize that AI de-skills people. I'd asked lots of students in class recently. I said, if I had to tell you to get to the southwest corner of Ireland, how would you go? How would you, would you be able to get there? They said, yeah, we'd go to Google Maps. I said, sorry, Google Maps is broken. Well, I'd ring my father. Sorry, the phone network is down. And then they're saying, well, how are we supposed to get there? So we've all become de-skilled because we all probably use a lot of these tools already. So the whole AI boom of the last couple of years, that's we've been de-skilling for years about this kind of stuff. So I think we do particularly have to recognize that there are core skills that AI risks de-skilling, and QS was talking about this in a News Digest article very recently on this new skills order, which was fascinating, and I shared with loads of different people. We need particularly to focus on cognitive skills, on critical thinking, and on problem solving, and creativity, I would say. And not just focus on those skills, but to make the connection with AI and kind of say, these are the things that AI is potentially going to take away from you. So yes, you learn how to use it appropriately, but recognize there is a danger that you will lose certain skills. You'll lose certain muscle and memory if you don't keep on using that critical thinking capacity, that problem solving capacity, and that creativity capacity in particular.
Mm. Yeah, I think I read an article recently. It was Socrates was talking to one of his students, and they were contemplating what thinking was, and they concluded that thinking was to ask questions. And if you put that into the modern landscape of what we do, sure, you can be using AI to explore and be curious, but demonstrating how you're using it to reflect and problem solve and in group working, it's a valuable and incredible tool to be able to allow you to actually think deeper and find out more. And when we're recruiting people here at QS, one of the things we look for is curiosity. Are you asking questions? Are you trying to find out more? And so that's in itself is a wonderful tool to learn how to use and demonstrate some of those skills that we're talking about today.
One of the best things about working in a university environment is you're surrounded by people who are literally extending the frontiers of knowledge. So that the idea of you're constantly questioning the status quo, you're constantly asking yourself, is there a different way to do this? Is just completely fascinating. And I think it's the ability to harness AI to push further is great. But I do agree with Chris that there will be de-skilling. The question is, are we going to add more skills that we haven't yet thought about through the use of AI? And it may matter less whether someone can get themselves from Dublin to Kerry in the right order. But I don't know. The issue is we only know what we know at the moment, and second guessing what the future is going to bring when you think about the sheer scale of madness over the last 10 years that we've all seen in a whole variety of social and economic contexts. I'm not a gambling woman at the best of times, and I certainly am not after my betting on 5 horses in the Grand National. Not a single one of them won. So I'm definitely not a gambler, but I think that ability to harness the power of AI in a positive context while being very alive to the dangers is kind of what we're all grappling with right now.
Yeah. Well, maybe let's think about that from a institutional perspective. And Martine, using some of your expertise, when you map alumni outcomes back to programs that are being delivered by universities, where do you most see, skills breaking down or misalignment?
It's an interesting question, Andy. So I'll share with you two examples from a study that we did. The first one is we took essentially 20 psychology students from 13 different universities, so 20 by university. And in the One Mentor platform, we're tracking what are the roles that they're interested in pursuing with their degree. On average, we found that 20 psychology students in the university will have 19 different career outcome objectives. And this will go all from clinical psychology, organization psychology, like the typical ones. But most commonly, actually, you'll see UI and UX designers, you'll see marketing roles that are not directly aligned, I would say, to how universities have mapped outcomes for those degrees. And interestingly, then on the other hand, we started working with the psychology faculty, looking at the curriculum, and what the faculty was telling us is, look, we built this program targeting 3 or 4 specific psychology occupations. We don't have the courses, the skills to be able to give students the opportunity to go and compete for UI UX roles, for marketing roles, and that, like, the business students will be better there. The technology students or the software ones would be better over here, or even the arts students. And it was very interesting then to look at what happens with the outcomes of students, actually. So then we took 65,000 alumni from this university, and we mapped how aligned were their first roles based to the degrees that they took. And we found that on average, 40% of the graduates would work in the field different from what they had studied as soon as they graduated university. So kind of looking back internally, and to Joan's point, is how do we actually remap the opportunities that our degrees give? And mostly kind of based on the skills. Actually, the skills are the kind of building blocks, as we said, of jobs, and tasks become kind of those skills. So I think that's the interesting component of how do we actually get from our students their desired paths and objectives. How do we build a university that can actually support them in a more personalized manner to provide last mile skills, for example, so they can compete. Those psychology students can actually show the unique skills they're bringing, plus the ones that the marketing students might have. And then they will have a much better, more complete profile, as Chris was talking, for example. It's more round. They probably have other areas. But especially in like the humanities and arts and liberal arts, it's where you see most of that break happening. Most of those graduates are working in fields unrelated to what they studied, or related actually, but in a broader spectrum that we have defined internally. So I think that's kind of the key component that we need to start looking, is really tracking our students' desires, tracking then our alumni outcomes, and seeing how we create more of these opportunities through, I think, the skillifying of our curriculum and understanding and the breaking these down. And AI becomes a really interesting point, because as John was mentioning, you can look at it in an augmentation and automation way. Essentially, AI will take specific tasks that you do in the role, and it'll optimize some, and on the other hand, it will allow you to do more of the same one. Critical thinking, for example. Most of the use of AI worldwide is actually for human skills, as we would call them. Better communication, critical thinking, so forth. Different ways of thinking about it, literally people prompting, how can I do these differently, and being creative. But then it becomes, how do we track how these roles, the titles might not change, but the building blocks internally will be altered a bit. And AI is going to be a new tool to augment the potential of the human, and we just need to be aware of it to be able to communicate that to the students, to be able to show them how can you drive a marketing campaign much quicker with AI. It's still the same thing. They still need the foundational knowledge the university has always given to the student, but now they just need to connect it to this new reality in maybe a new modality, or with new ways of articulating it, or maybe even new ways of connecting through co-ops, project-based learning. Like, I think all of these connections to the world of work will become more critical for them to put them into action.
Yeah, I think.
I mean, all of that is a key reason why we've set up York for Life, and it's still in its early stages, but it is about that opening up the awareness of the huge range of things that our alumni do. And I think sometimes the UK, I'm not quite familiar, Chris, and how they're doing it in Ireland, but the early stage of the graduate outcome survey is at such an early stage of people's careers, and the kind of definition of what constitutes a graduate job is quite narrowly defined as well, that it can lead to some levels of unhelpful hysteria about graduate employability that doesn't really, it doesn't capture the full gamut of where people end up over a 5, 10, 15-year period. And when you go back to the start of your own career, you know, how many people could say, you know, I was a full throttle high-earning person at the age of 22 relative to where they might be when they're 30. So we do a lot of alumni engagement, and when we did an economic analysis of the overall impact of the university, one of the things we included was a survey to our alumni, asking a series of questions which was geared to try to elicit the idea that even if you had studied biology, you might well be doing something completely different. But the overarching question is, do you feel your life is better because you've had a degree level education from the University of York? And 84% of them said yes, it was, which I thought was helpful.
I do think this brings back to a point, and whether it's a skill that you can develop or what, but it's about dealing with unpredictability. So dealing with the capacity to deal with unpredictability is seen as an important element within problem-solving capacity and within critical thinking. And essentially what Martine started talking about there was the uncertain world that's out there. So we often get second-level students coming to us kind of saying, oh, well, do this course, do that course, and what job will I get out of that? And increasingly we're kind of saying, well, I don't know, but you know what? Maybe 20 years ago we could have told you what job you could get out of that, but now we'd have to tell you which 5 jobs or which 5 careers you could get out of that particular course. So part of the message is, and part of the challenge, I suppose, is for us to build in and develop students' capacity to deal with unpredictability. And that's been recognised by the World Economic Forum, their Future of Jobs report. This is one of the elements they're talking about, the number of times that people will change careers. So partly, and it's to kind of pull it together a bit, that all of this focus on skills is nearly wrapped within an overall packaging of dealing with unpredictability. AI won't give you, AI is a fantastic tool, of course it is, but it's not going to necessarily give you that capacity for dealing with unpredictability. And I think that's a kind of a core message we need to get across to students, and also not be afraid of it. Just don't see it as a threat. See it as something that's going to open up countless opportunities for you. And that's a psychological journey, I think, for people.
Yeah, we haven't got long left, so I was keen to go to the questions that have been asked in the Q&A, and actually some of what you've just been talking about, Chris, covers the first 2 questions, which is everyone talks about skills gaps. This is from Parmjit Duggar. Everyone talks about skills gaps, but which specific skills are most consistently missing in graduates at the point of hire, and which are employers quietly deprioritizing despite universities still emphasizing them? So yeah, I guess the skills that, Martine has got his hand up. I think he's very keen to answer this one.
I love this question because it's very interesting. We always get this question on any conference, and it's like, just show me the table. What are the top 10 skills? We'll focus on those. But I think what we truly see having an impact and bringing it back is for what? Like, I think we need to start actually asking better questions internally, but the best skills or the skills that are needed for what role, for what sector, for what specifically. And the work we did with Joanne, for example, looking at like specific roles by sectors, then you can start asking questions of, well, in the creative industries, like what are the fastest growing roles and what are then the skills that are needed for these roles? And then you can get a list that's much more actionable, because there's not a one size fits all set of skills, I think, that will impact all roles equally. And even the human skills, we have different views, components to them based on the specific context in which they get applied. So even those would have nuanced differences and so forth. So I think the question there is, for what? And we have the internal components already. We can use degrees, for example. So we can take our specific programs and set objectives for those. And then very clearly we can then understand what are the top skills we should be tackling for our psychology students, for example, based on the outcomes that we see the market now requiring, or the national strategy or so forth, and then complementing these. I just saw a message that says that the sound's off, and I'm just wondering, Andy, do we know anything about that?
I can hear everyone. Hopefully working on it in the background.
Me too. I very much agree with Martine. I think context is everything. I also, and this is going to maybe a little controversial, I've worked in higher education a long time, and you hear some fairly persistent tropes, both in the media but also sometimes from employers. And I think certainly in the UK, I think employers need to do a lot more on-the-job training as well. And we have a fairly low rank in the OECD for on-the-job training. And so there are issues, I think, with the depiction of skills in the first place, but also in the onboarding and the skills development within particular sectors could be, in some cases, better as well. And I would say that is one of the things that we're calling for on the back of the report that we've done with QS on future labour market requirements is employers and higher education providers need to work a lot more closely together. And I think there's an agility question both for higher education but also for employers in terms of how much more agile can we be in terms of future curriculum design that isn't just a standard degree program, but it goes back to what I talked about earlier around unbundling and micro-credentials, because the labour market is changing so rapidly and we don't know where that end point is going to be. But I'm not expecting huge amounts of stability anytime soon. And I think we do need to have a much closer skills compact in the way that research and development and innovation, where higher education and big industry leaders and public sector are working much more closely to deliver a set of outcomes. We need a similar approach around skills. And in the UK, I think most of the regional economic development opportunities through the devolved mayoral issues are really, they're only focusing on the unskilled becoming somewhat skilled. They're not really thinking about the connectivity of graduate skills to economic growth opportunities, and we need to.
And just on that line as well, I suppose in Limerick, there's been a lot of emphasis on micro-credentials, but also on the development of professional diplomas. So rather than somebody thinking they have to come and do a full postgraduate degree, they can come and do a smaller professional diploma. And I suppose I think UL is kind of unique in this. They also now developed a Masters of Professional Practice where you can stack professional diplomas. So it isn't like you do a single master's program on a single theme. You could stack a professional diploma on leadership with the professional diploma on data analytics and build the skills that way. But just going back to the question around the skills that are missing, I think the World Economic Forum consistently in their list of core skills or employers' perceptions of core skills, they do emphasize a number of them and they keep on coming up. And there are a lot of these transferable skills, analytical thinking, creative thinking. There's a lot of these cognitive skills involved in it. I absolutely agree with Martine. The certain sectors and certain careers are going to require certain skills. But there is a bit of a pattern, and even QS's own work in terms of identifying those 5 skills of critical thinking, judgment, problem solving, etc. There's a bit of a pattern here around the kind of skills that are necessary now. How they appear and how they look in different contexts, may vary, but there's a certain core element here. So don't give up on the critical thinking, folks. It's kind of important.
But I think as well, experience is so important that however much you build additional skills portfolios within an educational environment, it does take time to understand the application of those to the job context that you're then in. And we shouldn't be so hard on 21, 22-year-olds entering in the labour market who are not, fully fledged Nunzio Quacquarellis, for instance, walking into the labour market as if they are fully formed. You're learning all the time, and if you're not learning, you're probably in the wrong job.
Yeah. Fantastic. Okay, well, we are very much running out of time now, so I'd just like to sort of summarise quickly that we've learned universities are all different stages at their journey of embedding skills and in the delivery, and that in itself is a shifting landscape, one in which universities need to be nimble and keep up with the changing requirements that employers have, and I guess also balancing that with the expectations of their students. And maybe our social license as universities has existed for a long time based on the transfer of knowledge out of universities, but I guess in a new era of AI, that's not perhaps as sustainable as it was, and we have to enable the skills that allow the use of knowledge to be transferred into a workforce in a really effective way and in a really human way as well. So I guess, as Chris was saying, are we allowing our students to recognize, record and reward their skills? If we aren't, how can we do that? And that's a question for everyone that's attended today. So thank you so much to all of our panelists today, Martine, Joan and Chris. Your expertise and insight is incredibly valuable. So thank you. And thanks to everyone who joined us in the audience as well and for taking part. I guess in terms of next steps for you, there is a recording for this, so please do share it and revisit it if you missed any of it. Please connect with our panelists on LinkedIn as well if you're interested in this area. I'm sure they can continue to pass on their expertise in that way. And if